Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session about content moderation. I would like to welcome the audience who is watching us, and I would also like to welcome the speakers of the panel. Again, welcome. Let me introduce myself. My name is Karine Nahon, and I'm an associate professor at the Information School at University of Washington, and I'm also an associate professor at IDC at the Government and Communication schools. I'm also the president of the Internet Association. My research deals around questions of politics of information and power. And lately, I've also established 2 NGOs in Israel, and I'm very happy to be the moderator of this panel. Before I go to the thematic introduction, I would like to give some technical matters to the audience. We want to make this panel interactive. So after the input statements from each one of the speakers and a short panel discussion, we will take questions from the audience. If you wish to ask questions, please use the question and answer feature, which you can find on the control board in the lower part of your screen. My helping hands in the director room will collect the question and feed them into the panel questions and discussion board. And obviously I will take it from there. So let me start. The topic of this panel is content moderation. And really, if whoever deals and research this topic knows that this is at the heart of the topic of digitization and democracy, what content we see, what types of content we are allowed to share, what features of sharing do we give users, in what circumstances, who's responsible and to what extent. All those questions are at the heart of looking at those platforms as a democratic kind of sphere. And we would like to deal with those questions in the panel, especially looking at platforms as intermediaries. We'll try to address some of those questions. And in fact, we have a wonderful kind of interdisciplinary panel for 3 different angles, from law, management, and computer science, which makes my life very easy. So let me start by the first speaker. I would like to introduce Jamal Green. And Jamal Green is a constitutional law expert whose scholarship focuses on the structure of legal and constitutional argument. He teaches constitutional law, comparative constitutional law, and the law of the political process, First Amendment, and federal courts. During 2018 and 19 academic year, Greene served as a senior visiting scholar at the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University, where he commissioned and oversaw new scholarly research related to free speech and new communication platforms. He has a visiting professor at Harvard Law School and has served as Columbia Law Vice Dean for Intellectual Life. He's currently serving as the co-chair of the Oversight Board, an independent body set up to review content moderation decisions on Facebook and Instagram. And I think we are all eager to know from you, Jamal, what worked well and what didn't work at the Oversight Board. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Karine, and thank you to all. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. So I'll say, just in my initial remarks, just a little bit about the Oversight Board and what I think it can do well and what I think some of its challenges are and are going to continue to be. The frame for the remarks is, of course, the enormous power that social media companies like Facebook, but also, of course, YouTube and Reddit and Twitter, a number of others, the power they have to influence global discourse and real world events. And that includes elections, that includes protests, that includes acts of violence. And I think the first thing to say, just as a frame for the whole discussion, is that the debate over content moderation is not about whether to moderate or not. It's about how to moderate. A completely unregulated platform would be susceptible to spammers and scammers and pornographers, and it wouldn't be a very usable platform. So every platform tries to prevent abuse of the platform to enable the platform to serve its purposes. More substantively, though, platforms have an interest in making sure the platform's not being used for harmful purposes. So for example, and these are the easy examples, to coordinate a terrorist attack or to coordinate electoral disinformation campaigns. Already we run into some trouble, right? Because, what is terrorism? How do you determine what counts as disinformation? How do you engineer your systems to detect these things at scale? How do you strike the balance between false positives and false negatives? But okay, let's say you get past the more obvious content categories and get to other types of screening that a platform or its users might reasonably want to occur, right? Whether it's for nudity or sexual content, whether it's hate speech, whether it's bullying or harassment, privacy violations, incitement to violence. These are both a policy challenge and an execution challenge, right? So for a lot of these things, it's going to be a hard judgment call about what counts and what doesn't count. Often there will be harassment or harsh language, but also in the same content, political speech that one might think should be protected or is important to democratic governance. Some of these things you can train an algorithm reasonably well to detect, and others you really can't, and are going to rely too much on context or local knowledge. And again, you have the ever-present question of whether you care more about false positives or false negatives, and that might vary based on what kind of content we're talking about. This is what the Oversight Board was created to address, and it's really, I think, two problems. One is the substantive problem of many of these content calls being really difficult, but it's also kind of a process problem of Facebook not being an especially trustworthy actor for policing content. Facebook has profit motives. Lots of people suspect that leads it to promote more sensationalist content. Other people suspect that leads Facebook to be aligned with a kind of Silicon Valley groupthink that stifles free expression. So the point of the Oversight Board is really to create as independent a body as you reasonably can, give it some protections against retaliation from Facebook, and you staff it with people who have some expertise, ask it to review the content decision. So we do that as a collective body. We issue written opinions. We try to draw on principles of international human rights law to try to conform Facebook's community standards to a consistent set of rules and standards and principles. Now, there are a bunch of challenges here, and I'll just mention three very briefly, and we can follow up in the Q&A. I'll call them the problem of scale, the problem of law, and the problem of implementation. Right. So the problem of scale stems from the fact that the Oversight Board currently has 20 members. We work part-time. We review content on a platform that has nearly 3 billion users, that hosts 1 billion pieces of content every day. We make an effort to choose cases that are likely to affect large numbers of users or that are particularly important socially or politically, but one can't do justice one case at a time in this context. Now, there are a few ways of trying to respond to that. I'll just mention one here, which is to focus less on the particular case and its outcome, and more on the ways in which decisions that something like the Oversight Board can make and any accompanying recommendation might contribute to what you might call a culture of rule of law, or a rule of law culture. In our decisions, we have tended to value transparency, process, clarity, consistency, and to my mind, it's more important to consistently emphasize those values than it is to overturn or uphold any particular decision. The second problem, I called it the problem of law. Facebook is, of course, a private entity. It's not bound by international human rights law for the most part. The company has committed itself to international human rights law principles, but it's not clear what that means in the context of a private social media platform. International human rights law is underspecified in the context of platforms, right? So it's developed largely in the context of state violence or detention or liability of some kind. It's not generally been focused on issues of platforms. You're hosting speech and making decisions about what kind of platform you want to be or don't want to be. So adapting international human rights standards to this kind of setting is complex, and it's unexplored, and that's a challenge for the board. The third and final challenge I'll just mention is the implementation challenge, right? How do you get Facebook to scale up the board's decisions and recommendations? And how do you monitor its progress? And all I'll say for now, just in the interest of just this being a framing discussion, is that the challenge here is to create rules and recommendations that are both ambitious and feasible, right? So if Facebook implements none of the board's recommendations, right, the board is useless, right? And so, so we can't be too ambitious beyond what Facebook is reasonably able to do. But if Facebook implements all of the board's recommendations, that sounds like success, but that's really a sign that the board is not challenging the status quo as much as it probably should, right? So that calibration requires both working very closely with Facebook and its engineers and its content team, but also maintaining our independence, right? And so that's challenging, and maintaining both distance and also having to work with a platform and trust it to some extent is challenging, and that's something that I think we'll be working through over time. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Jamal. I would like to introduce our next speaker, Professor Gerhard Vaikum from the Max Planck Institute of Informatics. Gerhard is a computer scientist serving as a scientific director at the Max Planck Institute for Informatics. Since 2003, his research spans scalable systems for data management and analysis, the integration of understructured text and structural data, and automatic construction of large knowledge bases from web and text sources. Vaikum is an ACM fellow and elected member of various academics, and he served on the German Council of Science and Humanities. He received the ERC Synergy Grant on Privacy, Accountability, Complication, and Trust, and the ACM Zygmunt Edgar Cod Innovation Award for pioneering work on the automatic construction of large knowledge bases. And just to kind of like start the discussion, Gerhard, from your perspectives, what are the technological challenges that you see in content moderation? The floor is yours.
Thanks, Karine. So let me broaden the question a little bit. Let me actually start with what I think of the human approach to content moderation, and then I'll talk to the technology perspective. So there is a notion of self-organizing user communities, which helps taming offensive content, taming conspiracy theories, and whatever else we would like to see blocked or banned. An example is Wikipedia, with its 1,000 or so administrators who intervene upon vandalism, but also on unsupported claims made within articles. An interesting point is that these admins are appointed by the community itself through a system of nominations and voting. Second example is Reddit, a large platform, not the same scale as Facebook, but reasonably large. And it actually hosts communities. So there's like in the order of 100,000 different communities, often on very specialized topics related to politics, specific topics within politics, but also sports, games, lifestyle, health, and so on. And in its long tail, there's some exotic communities like Cosmic Disclosure, Truth Leaks, or the Donald, before it was actually removed from Reddit. Now, Reddit has an interesting notion also that users can downvote on posts. And that gives you an interesting handle in affecting the visibility of posts and enhance the reputation of users, which is an important element of self-organization. Now, in addition, there's also moderators who can block content, remove contents, block and ban users, or terminate entire communities. None of this is perfect. So in particular, banned users can quickly re-enter by creating themselves a new anonymous account. So obviously, we need smarter mechanisms here to influence these potentially malicious users by imposing some notion of cost on their behavior. So making bad posts would have a cost if you have a budget of only 5 posts per day. This would be one example. The rate at which these users can reincarnate themselves through creating anonymous accounts could also be tamed in some manner. So this is the human approach. Now let's move to the technological side, which is why I'm on this panel, I guess. Self-organization does not easily scale to platforms with tens of millions or hundreds of millions of users. So it's not a viable approach upfront for Facebook, I think. And this is where computer science comes into play with AI and machine learning tools for automatic content annotation. How does this work? We need training data. Machine learning is powerless and useless if you don't have training data. This has to be in the form of sample posts, which are manually annotated with labels like hateful versus civilized, or factual versus fake, and so on. The computer can then use this training data to learn an automatic classifier based on deep neural networks and other machine learning technology. The results, I'm not talking industrially deployed cases, I'm talking research studies. So the results are pretty good. They reach 90% precision, but there are concerns. And I'll list just 3 major concerns here. The first one is 90% precision sounds great, but conversely, it means 10% errors. And at internet scale, this is just not bearable, right? This is a huge issue. You cannot manually fix 10% errors if you're talking billions of posts every day. Second, the AI tools right now give you merely a binary output, so there's no explanation. And explainability of results is crucial, obviously, giving evidence or counter evidence to whatever the annotation or judgment would be. But this kind of explainability and human-centric trustworthiness is a huge research issue in AI and machine learning overall, not just for content moderation. Finally, training data may be outdated simply because internet contents rapidly evolves in both language style. Users adapt to whatever filtering tools might be there, but also our society moves very fast. And therefore also the topical foci rapidly evolve. That means the classifier needs to be frequently retrained. And the bottleneck then is to get the right training data in large amounts at the right time, in time. Right? So keeping up with the enormous pace of the world and the internet is a huge challenge. So let me wrap up with some research directions that I would like to see intensified. Self-organization works in communities like Wikipedia and Reddit reasonably well, not perfectly. So the big challenge would be what can be done to move it to the next level of the scale of Facebook and similar in a way that is reliable, scalable, and continuously adaptive. Number 2, it's clear that AI tools and human reviewing must be combined in some manner. There's different ideas of how to go about this, but the jury is still out there. It's still totally unclear what is the right approach. I think Jamal also referred to this. And number 3, I think anonymous posts and fully anonymous users are an issue because they are never held liable for anything, and they can amplify themselves easily or reincarnate very rapidly. So this needs more thought on kind of shaping or influencing the behavior of malicious users by imposing some notion of cost, not necessarily monetary, but some mechanism to tame behavior. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gerhard. I would like to introduce the last speaker, Lior Zalmanson. Lior is from the College School of Management at Tel Aviv University. And Lior is a senior lecturer at the Technological and Information Management program at that school. His research interests include social media, internet business models, and sharing economy, and algorithmic management, and the future of work. His research has been published in leading journals like the Academy of Management Journal and MISQ. He won awards and grants from the Fulbright Foundation, Dan David Prize Grant, Web, Google, Marketing Science Institute, and more. In 2016, he was appointed as a research fellow at the Metropolitan Museum Media Lab. Lior is also the head of the Digital Forum for Israeli chapter of the International Council of Museums, and he's the founder of the Print Screen Festival, an Israeli digital culture festival which connects internet researchers, activists, artists, and more. Lior, I would like to ask you a very general question. What do you think the impact of content moderation and social media on social media and on online engagement?
Wow, truly big question. Thank you first for your lovely introduction, and I also wish to extend my gratitude to the organizers of this event. So first, social media, who's been around for almost 20 years now, has thrived on user engagement, right? And user engagement is best created when you struck an emotional chord with the user. If you have seen the Pixar film Inside Out about all the emotions running in one's head, you know that it is easiest to manipulate emotions such as anger and disgust. Social media is built on this highly emotional, highly engaging, but often polarizing and sometimes controversial content, because key metrics for long were keeping users viewing and having them contribute content for longer periods. But you know what? I'm actually old enough to remember a pre-social media time where the internet behaved quite differently. And I think Gerhard mentioned this in some of the self-organizing communities. And I want to refer to it as well in order to fully understand the phenomenon. So I was a kid on the internet once, and it was the 90s, and issues such as content moderation were not even spoken back at the day. In preparing for this conference, I asked myself the naive question of why was it so? And when I built my website, I remember it was on GeoCities, it was my own responsibilities to decide what gets deleted and what's not. And I remember my shock when I first encountered hate speech in what was my website's guest book. And I remember pressing the delete and feeling a bit guilty of becoming a censor, even if my deletion was justified. But the internet back in the day was different. It wasn't less social, but it was definitely on a smaller scale. It had many bugs and pretty terrible design. It had a big emphasis on fantasy and meeting strangers. It wasn't to be fully trusted. We didn't use our credit cards. I have this message by Microsoft still copied from back in the day that warns me not to give out my real name on instant messaging and chats. So the internet required less moderations because we took everything on it with a grain of salt. We knew everyone can be a dog or a cat for that matter. But many virtual waters have flowed under the internet bridge, and today the internet means business. In the last years, many of these businesses have been social media and platform businesses. So platforms, of course, just to have a very broad definition, is when a company provides a space for content creation, transactional exchange, and interaction between the different parties, which means the company is mainly in the business of trust of other parties of the interaction that is mediated through the trust in the platform. In this new internet, there's usually two commandments. The persistent idea of the self, which means your idea in the virtual world should be identical to the one you have in the real life, and everything is data, which means that platforms persuade you to contribute user-generated content and makes users engage for longer to create more data points, both for their ad networks and other sorts of machine analysis. Now, the amplification of user-generated content and the fact that websites and platforms have equated, they have made the virtual world and the real world one and the same in the effort to raise trust levels, they have resulted in this massive need for content moderation. And the fight for content moderation is existential challenge for these companies, as was mentioned. Similar to a degree with cutting sugar on Coca-Cola or the fat in fast food, it's the ingredient that keeps you wanting more. It's supposedly bad business to take that ingredient out. And for a while, platforms worked behind the scenes on this. Content moderation was the same as garbage disposal. You don't want your customers to see the dirty side of the business. They did not want to know that there were politics involved or business considerations. And at least in part, we turned a blind eye. We were led to believe that moderation is done almost automatically, that it's objective, that it's some trick. We were in love with this idea of frictionless social environment, with the disintermediation, which meant getting rid of unnecessary middlemen. We felt that social media is a true democratic space. We weren't even aware that we invented new middlemen, that we invented roles that never existed due to these new internet practices. But now, we are at this moment of change. We first demanded accountability and transparency from the platforms, which is great, but it's not enough. We must examine the role of individuals, societies, and global organizations in doing this dirty work, or at least discussing the repercussions of such work. Content moderation in that sense is way too serious to be left to corporates. Facebook in the last few years have done a few interesting steps in that direction. Jamal has already discussed the oversight board, so I want to mention a different emphasis of Facebook on Facebook groups. So I don't know if you know this, but Facebook now promotes shared spaces. So Gerhard has mentioned Reddit and he's mentioned Wikipedia. In some essence, Facebook wants to be more of that. So it promotes shared spaces in forms of groups, and it delegates some content moderation responsibility to the volunteer admins. This in some ways is the move between a frictionless network, which was the symbol for Facebook for a very long time, to a friction-full community model that is actually very common in the old 90s internet. This is the idea that having more people in the conversation, that it can be messy, it might be a headache, but in its essence, in essence, these frictions is what makes it democratic. So increasing awareness, our involvement in the dilemmas and notions of content moderation can really help increase conversations and discussions about morals and ethics in the relevant sub-communities, in different contexts, in different languages. As a result, I see content moderation as a game changer, as a disruptor, not only transforming the social environment from networks back to communities, but maybe also transforming business models from ad-based business models and counting eyeballs to little by little having users taking responsibility over sustainability of these websites, for instance, by subscription and patronage, and becoming really the central stakeholder in this. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Lior, and thank you, the three of you. This has been a very interesting talk, so real thanks. I would like to start by a big question, actually. I will start with you, Gerhard, if that's okay with you. Your work is mainly about AI tools, and part of the problem of AI tools is by using the training data that you've mentioned, but the training data that you mentioned is taken in fact from real life. Sometimes it's not that diverse, sometimes it is diverse, but it is taken from a society, from a contextual society, which means that it is also taken with all the inequalities, with the value-based, I would say, democratic value of the context. And we saw it in different directions. In what way is it our role as engineers, this time I'm taking the hat of the engineers, to adjust the inequalities that already is part of a particular society and is a reflection inside the AI system? Can you maybe talk a little bit about that? Because I think that is in the heart of the democratic challenge.
You're perfectly right. Training data is the key driver. It's not the algorithms, which often people talk about. It's really which data are you using? In preparation for this, I looked at some boundary conditions. So the European Union has this new draft on AI Act or whatever it's called in preparation. It's draft mode. And it talks about the requirement that training data should always be complete, 100% correct and representative. That's a total myth. That's absolutely impossible. It will always have be incomplete in some manner. It will always carry some bias, and we have to live with this. Now, the bias can creep in from a different point. So it could be something that just reflects society. There have been some studies of gender bias in literature, or, you know, these some machine learning tool says male to doctor is like female to nurse, which is a bias, and it's not how our society should be. But these are historical biases that are carried over from mankind's history, right? They are not even from the data collection. But there are other biases that creep in through the way the data is collected, or the data can quickly become outdated, and we should actually gather new data. But data gathering always has for training purposes, always has a cost. Now, who takes care of this? There's research on fairness, debiasing data, making sure that minorities are also represented. This is ongoing foundational science, right? So don't expect this to reach any breakthroughs anywhere soon. Which leaves one of your questions: who is responsible for this? Well, engineers are partly responsible, but as I said, it's not the algorithms. It's not that you need algorithmic expertise on this. It's really a data curation issue, and that goes beyond the engineering. So there's certainly responsibilities on more shoulders than just the engineers. But it's a huge issue. It's the key issue, probably.
I'll return to it later, because in some cases, the algorithm does create some, I would say, cleavages and some gaps in terms of the consequences. But let me ask a question for Lior and Jamal. I mean, if you can turn on your audio. And by the way, for the audience who see us, you're very welcome to submit questions to the panelists. We'll take them in a few minutes. So both of you have mentioned, Lior and Jamal. Sorry, I've listened carefully, and you mentioned the word transparency quite a few times. In fact, as Jamal, you mentioned it as one of the main values of the oversight board, and then you mentioned it in the context of the platform itself, and Lior as well. And I have this kind of feeling that we've been in this discussion for, I don't know, like 15 years. We've been talking about transparency as if that's the only key really that we have, or the only leverage that we have on platforms. And in a way, the word transparency, which I like to say so many times as well, is just a kind of a mask for us to say, we don't know how to deal with it. We don't really know what to do with it. So, okay, so we can ask the platforms to be more transparent. Jamal, you mentioned we want to make a kind of a result that is feasible and ambitious at the same time. So in a way, we are all the time in this tango, and I feel that we run to the transparency kind of thing, and it doesn't really give us the real solution to many of the problems that deal with democracy.
So, I think you're right. I don't disagree with anything you've said about transparency, and it's as lawyers say, it's a second best, or maybe a third best. But you know, I'm someone who tends to think that a lot of the problems around content moderation, you know, you talk about whether transparency is the solution. I think that at a point one has to just be candid that there is no solution. You know, the problems that arise are problems of disagreement. They're problems of just being in a complex world. They're problems of value pluralism, that we have lots of different things that we're committed to all at the same time, and so it manifests itself in, and I'll just take Facebook as an example, but you can repeat this for lots of other contexts. Everyone is sort of upset about something, but they're opposite problems, right? You know, when you think about the politics of it, you know, the left and the right are both really mad at Facebook, but for totally opposite reasons. and it's not, and so from both perspectives, it's Facebook is doing something wrong. Well, that depends on your perspective. Wrong from one perspective is right from another, which isn't to say that there's nothing one can do. You don't just throw up your hands. But I do think the substantive problem of how to moderate content is in so many contexts just a problem of having to choose something to be committed to over something else that one might reasonably think one should also be committed to. And so as I think about what do you do about this, I think you have to be clear about what your choices are. You have to be clear about the fact that you're making choices. Be clear about the trade-offs that you are implementing. And I'm not sure we can ask for much more with respect to a problem of this scale. Now, of course, governments could get involved, but governments have their own incentives and their own pathologies as well, and their own agendas, right? So I do think that we can ask a platform to keep its promises to its users and to the community, and to be willing to take a punch when they've done something wrong. That's clearly wrong, right? But I think for the most part, we're talking about pluralism rather than talking about a problem that can be solved or that has a particular solution.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with everything that was said, and thus far, I really think that transparency is maybe a first step at the very least, but it's definitely not a solution. I worry, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, that people chose for a very long time to turn a blind eye to these phenomena. So I really think that platforms' main role is to involve people in the conversation, and just giving them a page full of rules and regulations or community guidelines is usually not enough to raise this conversation. It might be interesting for mediators like journalists that can then hopefully make this public in more engaging ways. But really, I think our challenge is to promote an understanding in society, as Jamal said, that it's an impossible problem. And impossible problems cannot be solved by corporates, but they cannot be solved by governments as well. But they can at least be discussed and be discussed in a dynamic manner that takes into consideration different contexts, different voices that are currently just not part of the conversation at all. So it is about, so transparency is just the stepping stone into much more interesting deliberation, hopefully much more interesting discussions.
But if I hear Jamal is saying that it's, as you said, it's an impossible kind of a question and a challenge that we don't have a solution. So we're not supposed to raise our hands. In fact, part of what I'm trying to think, and maybe the question is also a technological question, what are the mechanisms that we have in terms of governments and societies to make those platforms accountable? And in what cases do we want to make those platforms accountable? As you mentioned, Jamal, those are private institutions on the one hand. On the other hand, we know that they control the public sphere in terms of, for example, Facebook, 2.8 billion users. So except saying that we don't have a solution, do we have any mechanisms? I mean, fines, economic fines that the EU has been giving to Google and Facebook don't work. We know that. So what kind of other mechanisms do we have? And Gerhard, feel as well to jump. This is a question for the three of you.
So certainly transparency could help here, but not in this universal umbrella sense. Show us everything, show us your code, show us all your data and so on. This is impossible, this is naive, and it won't help anybody. Nobody will understand anything and they will just drown in data. But transparency in the sense that mechanisms in these platform providers are auditable and scrutable by trusted organizations. So they could audit whether there are the right mechanisms for removing illegal or offensive content conditioned on the specific country's regulations within a certain time period. And then, why are you so pessimistic that fines don't have an influence? They need to be higher, right? Didn't we have this where one of the companies had to pay like $1 billion or $500 million? I mean, they don't care about 10 billion. This is the postage money, right, that they spend. But if you go higher up, they do care. And also the bad press hurts them. So because that is bad for business, right? So I think they're willing to cooperate, but they're also driven by business and business only, unless there are boundary conditions given by regulations.
I would like, before turning to the audience, I would like to raise a question about anonymity. I think you mentioned it, Gerhard, but also I think Lior, but feel free, Jamal, also to jump in. The idea, the anonymity of the users has been changed during the several few years as we started, as you said, Lior, nobody knows you're a dog. The nice cartoon into what we are today. More platforms are becoming more authentic in terms of trying to understand who are the users behind. Two-factor authentication, they make sure that this is your phone, this is who you are, they know exactly who stands behind. And I'm wondering whether this topic of anonymity that has also so much impact on the performance, on the way that we actually show ourselves to the world. For example, on social movements, Black Lives Matter has been very strong in terms of the way that they perform in different levels of anonymity. The question is maybe we've been giving users too much freedom in terms of creativity, and this is part of the payment that we pay right now. And maybe part of the solutions that we're trying, again, part of the solution, there would not be a solution, but trying to think about different mechanisms that will control the anonymity of the users, making them less anonymous. And I know, Lior, you've been working on that a little bit on different platforms. What do you think?
I think, first of all, in many platforms, Facebook as a main example, anonymity is discouraged or not allowed at all. Google Plus, I remember Eric Schmidt saying it's an identity network, identity service, and not really a social network. So it's true that on Twitter, anonymity is still a thing, and in Reddit and other spaces as well. But if anything, I feel like we become less creative over the last 10 years compared to like all-time platforms, all-time websites. I worry that anonymity is not the cause for violence or hate speech. Unfortunately, we discovered in the last few years that people have no problem being racist, being hateful, being misogynic, anti-Semitic, whatever, under their full name and picture. This is definitely not it. What we have seen in social research, that it is a lot about the mediation of the screen. People allow themselves to act in a different way when they are protected by the screen, when they are supposedly protected by the website. So there's another question here in this forum, and of course we talked about the accountability of the platforms, which is true and relevant, but it's also about the accountability of these people that you mentioned, I think, Karine. Now, I'm not sure that the solution is, a social credit system similar to China, where, bad behavior on one platform will be carried and have consequences in the real world. But I do think that a lot of people are planning for that specific future. I can share one more thing, is that I do believe in some ways we are going back to fantasy in the internet. I think what we see now is the growing power of video game platforms becoming social networks. In these platforms, this is the exact issue that you mentioned. Users get a lot of creativity, get a lot of anonymity, a lot of mediation of avatars and such. And what I see now that platforms are hoping for is making or creating a situation in which you are not really anonymous to the platform. You are fully accountable for your actions, but you are fully anonymous to the rest of the people in the social world, in the virtual world or the metaverse, which I also think is problematic. I think this helps to some degree with making people accountable for their actions, but it's not fully democratic, because that gives platforms way more leverage and people very little understanding of who stands in front of them.
Yeah. I have to ask another question before moving to the audience. I can't help myself. Jamal, the oversight board. So I had the pleasure to be part of the roundtables before the oversight board was created. They done I think in 15 countries a kind of a roundtable, and part of the discussion that came in the roundtables was about creating a body that will have a stake not only in terms of the recommendation, but also as what you call the rule of law in the platform. So making a more, I would say, most of you are independent figures, very strong figures. And part, I think, of what happened is on the one hand, you can give only recommendation. On the other hand, you kind of like address how many 5 cases per year, even less in the first year. So maybe you can talk a little bit about this very delicate balance and whether you see a potential of moving forwards towards a more independent council, I would say, of content moderation, not only on Facebook, but on other platforms as well, that has a more substantial, I would say, stake in what they do and what are the community guidelines, et cetera.
So I see a couple of questions in there. One is about the recommendation function of the board. We make binding decisions on review of particular pieces of content, but recommendations the board makes are not binding on Facebook. And then a second issue, related issue of kind of universality or scalability of the oversight board model to other platforms, or whether there might be some collaboration potential. On the first point, I do think, so I tend to think that the recommendations, over the long run at least, the recommendations that the oversight board makes are much more important than the individual content decisions. And the board can make recommendations in the context of an individual case, and is also asked questions can also be asked questions by Facebook. Now, of course, it's not binding on Facebook. At least at this stage of the oversight board's life, I would not want the things that the oversight board says to be binding on Facebook. We don't know enough to make binding recommendations. And Facebook also, I think Facebook's own accountability is important as well. So sort of outsourcing certain decisions entirely to a separate body is in the same way that politicians should not outsource all of their decisions to judges. They have to take some ownership over the decisions they make as well. So I'm not sure that's a model I would necessarily want. Going back to transparency, that buzzword, the fact that the board's recommendations are transparent and that Facebook is required to respond to them publicly is an important part of the conversation, right? So that Facebook doesn't want to ignore the board. Facebook doesn't want the board to get annoyed. That's not good for Facebook's own reputation and its own publicity, right? So I think it's important. I think as the board learns more about Facebook, about how it operates, about what it does well and what it doesn't do well, its recommendations will be more tailored over time and more important over time, right? So I think that's an important function. I'm quite skeptical at this stage. I mean, or I should say, I'm quite cautious at this stage about talking about the board in relation to other platforms, because I don't know if it's successful as to Facebook. I mean, I think it is an experiment. I'm not one who does sort of PR about the board. I think it has its pluses and minuses, and we'll see, right? It's very young. We're only a year old, basically. And I think if it works well, I think there may very well be good reasons for it to expand it or to collaborate with other platforms. Facebook is of a scale that creates its own problems and its own challenges that may be different for smaller platforms or for platforms that are more like Wikipedia or Reddit, as Gerhard says. I think, you know, the solutions, what I do think is that having some institution that mediates between, you know, that's not strictly user control and is not government, is important. I think we need something in that middle space, but exactly what structure it has, I think, is going to be very contextual. And even if this works for Facebook, I'm not sure if it will necessarily work for other platforms. It's very expensive too.
Yeah, that's true. Let me pass to the audience questions. And so I would start actually with a question to all of you that we've got from the audience. So far, the discussion has been about huge platforms like Facebook rooted in the ClearNet. But my question is, how can we improve content moderation, for example, in the darknet, which is known to be space for illegal and often anti-democratic activities? And I will add also in the peer-to-peer kind of platforms like WhatsApp and Signal and Telegram and other stuff. So the question is to the three of you, whoever wants to pick it up. Maybe not of you wants to pick it up.
I feel, at least in the peer-to-peer, the major question here is privacy, right? Because this is where content moderation also negates or challenges the question of privacy in these places. We have, or most users feel that you know, what's going on between people in a group conversation or in one-on-one conversation on WhatsApp or Signal is private. Facebook, even in the case of WhatsApp, explains that this is being encrypted, which gives at least some idea, like people have this idea that this is not being monitored, this is not being moderated at all. And it's a question because what is in this case the border or the line, right? Will we moderate also conversation in public places between people, not mediated by technology? Like, is it really different in its essence than having just private conversations without any technology interference? And I really think that in these sort of conversation, this is maybe something we should avoid in actually speaking about democracy and freedom of speech. But that's just me. And
I'll just add, to supplement what Lior says. You know, I think the main reason the oversight board is not does not have any jurisdiction over WhatsApp is for privacy reasons. And not just privacy itself, but how Facebook wants to market WhatsApp and to its users as something that is that is between them. But I quite agree from a legal perspective. I'm not sure there's any. I mean, there are some privacy reasons, but for the same reason why the government can't very easily figure out what you're saying in the privacy of your home. It's hard for the government to figure out what you're saying in a peer-to-peer on a peer-to-peer network, but it's not. I'm not sure that the technology makes it different in kind. It's different in degree, but you know, engaging in illegal activity or coordinating illegal activity, there are ways of getting at that as well through ordinary law enforcement.
Yeah, I would like just to ask a last question. Gerhard, you are on the grill here. Audience question to Jamal. Sorry, it's for Jamal. I thought for some reason it's for Gerhard. So it's about really in the past we had few powerful media like New York Times, Washington Post, and Time Magazine, Newsweek. Could you comment on how social media has contributed in disrupting the monopoly of content?
Well, I'll just continue with a theme of it's both and which is to say that it has disrupted various monopolies, sort of intermediary monopolies that used to be a role that used to be played by major media organizations, and democratizing and popularizing access to information, ability to contribute to public discourse has lots of benefits that are obvious, I think, and part of the premise of the question, but also has lots of costs in terms of, and I think the primary one is in terms of trust, and that, you know, the benefit of Walter Cronkite, right, is that you could trust him, and the downside is that it's just him, right? So that's an accountability issue and an elitism issue, and so I think, I mean, I don't know that the valence is in one direction or the other. It's a different world. It's a world with fewer or with more intermediaries, but not ones that we really can trust. And I'm not sure quite how to restore that. You know, I think there are ways in which platforms can promote certain content over others that can help with that trust deficit without necessarily sacrificing some of the benefits of social media and the democratizing elements of it. But I do think it's, you know, it's not unidirectional. It has costs and benefits.
So I'm giving the signal that we need to kind of like have a statement of a take-home statement from each one of you. I mean, unless Gerhard, I saw that you unmuted yourself, so maybe you would like to say something and give also the take-home message.
On this latter point, there's trust by authority or reputation, but there's also this saying, "In God we trust, all others need to bring data." So there is actually the journalistic principle of giving evidence and supporting references. That applies to the democratized media channels, partisan journalists, and whatever you want to name them as well. So this is one way to regain trust, at least in terms of fact-checking and these kinds of things.
Yeah. So let's pass by a take-home statement. Lior, would you like to start your take-home statement?
Sure. So there's this notion in disability activism that says nothing about us without us. And I think this should be also true, or we should learn from it in the field of content moderation or discussing content moderation. For a long while, we looked at it as garbage disposal, and we left the dirty works to be done at, you know, closed spaces by others that we don't know. We haven't even mentioned today that there are people that have this dirty job of, you know, looking at these images and these videos for day in and day out. And we should think about it, and we should think about it as society. What is our responsibility for it? It's not just a platform like Facebook, it's everyone's, because it's an internet problem, because it's a global problem. And I think we should raise conversations in our societies and our communities about it, and at least consider our responsibility and our role in the future in this.
Thank you. Jamal, take-home statement.
Sure, I think I would just emphasize that content moderation is difficult because it's difficult. You know, I think the presence of actors who are profit motivated or actors who are engaged in bad faith activity, right, tends to make people blame those actors for the problems of social media. And I've come to believe that, of course, there are bad faith actors. Of course, there are profit motives and other kinds of agendas that can interfere with decision making or lead people to make bad judgments. But the challenge of content moderation doesn't depend on that bad faith or that profit motive, right? It exists in the best of possible worlds, and it's ineradicable. And so I think the answer to it is not necessarily we have to strike a different balance between speech and regulation of speech or anything like that. But I think it's more to emphasize a culture of justification, a culture of transparency, a culture of consistency, a culture of principled decision-making. And that's about the best we can do, but that's pretty good if we can get there.
Gerhard, your take-home statements.
I'm personally intrigued by this grassroots notion of self-organizing communities. They are not totally grassroots. There is some steering involved, of course. It is a really intriguing way of influencing the visibility of posts. So once something gets downvoted, it's not censored away. It just demoted in visibility, in the default view, in rankings and recommendations. That could be a powerful instrument. The challenge is to go to scale. I mean, does this work beyond specialized communities? Very unclear to me. My second takeaway would be that in the long run, we need a combination of human reviewing, whether it's through user communities engaging themselves or through workforce centers with human assessors who work full day on the dirty laundry, as Lior called it. But to relieve these people and also to go to scale, we need AI tools. This is inevitable. Which role they will eventually take place? Will they filter away the easy cases? Will they provide more evidence or counter evidence to human judges? There's many ways of helping. One simple is, for example, once content is flagged bad or offensive, non-factual, whatever, removed de facto, it will reappear. It will come up again. So there's a duplicate or near duplicate, and AI is good at detecting these. Otherwise, you're really fighting an uphill battle if you just have your human reviewer team.
Thank you, thank you. So I would like to conclude this panel by saying, first of all, thank you, all of you, Lior, Gerhard, Jamal. And for the audience, I would like to invite you tomorrow to the panel at 3 p.m. German time or 4 p.m. Jerusalem time about new directions, potential for enhancing democracy. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you later.